The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the mahogany floors that Kate had walked countless times before. Today felt different. The familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet seemed to echo with a finality that made her chest tighten. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the polished banister, and took a deep breath that didn't quite fill her lungs the way it should have. William stood in the drawing room below, his back turned to her as he gazed out at the gardens where their children had played just yesterday. His shoulders, usually so straight and confident, seemed to carry an invisible weight that made him appear smaller somehow. Kate noticed how his hair caught the early sunlight, the way it always had during their university days at St. Andrews when everything seemed possible and the future stretched endlessly before them like an open road. She remembered the first time she had seen him in that very same light, 23 years ago in a lecture hall that smelled of old books and nervous energy. He had been just another student then, albeit one who drew whispers and curious glances wherever he went. Kate had been determined to treat him like anyone else, a resolution that lasted exactly until he smiled at her during their first conversation about art history, and she felt something shift inside her chest like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Now, as she watched him from the staircase, she could see that same young man in the set of his shoulders, but overlaid with years of duty, responsibility, and the gradual understanding that their lives would never truly belong to them alone. The palace around them held memories in every corner, from George's first wobbly steps in the nursery to Charlotte's elaborate tea parties in the conservatory, from Louis's infectious laughter echoing through the halls to quiet moments when she and William had stolen away to simply be together without the weight of the world watching. Kate began her descent, each step deliberate and measured. She had learned over the years to move with purpose even when her heart felt like it might shatter with each beat. The sound of her heels on the marble seemed too loud in the silence that had settled over their home like dust over forgotten furniture. William turned at the sound, and when their eyes met, she saw her own grief reflected back at her, magnified by the love that had sustained them through everything life had thrown their way. The news had come 3 days ago, delivered by men in dark suits who spoke in careful, measured tones about national security and unavoidable circumstances. Words like temporary separation and protective custody had floated around the room like smoke, obscuring the simple truth that they were being torn apart for reasons beyond their control. Kate had listened with the same composed expression she had perfected for state dinners and public appearances, while inside something fundamental began to crack. William had argued, of course. His voice had risen in a way that reminded Kate of their early days together when his temper could flare bright and quick before cooling into reasoned discussion. But this time, the anger had nowhere to go. It crashed against the immovable walls of protocol and necessity until it exhausted itself, leaving only the terrible acceptance that some things were beyond even his influence. The children didn't know yet. That conversation waited for them like a storm on the horizon, and Kate felt sick thinking about how to explain to George, Charlotte, and Louis why Mummy would be going away for a while. How do you tell a child that the world can be dangerous in ways they can't understand, that sometimes protecting the people you love means leaving them behind? The questions would come, as they always did from their bright, curious children, and she would have to find answers that made sense of the senseless. As Kate reached the bottom of the stairs, William turned fully to face her. The morning light from the windows behind him created a halo effect that reminded her of their wedding day, when he had waited for her at the altar of Westminster Abbey with that same expression of love mixed with something deeper, more complex. Today, that complexity had deepened into something that looked like grief for the living. "The cars will be here soon," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same careful control he used during official ceremonies. But Kate heard the tremor underneath, the way his words wanted to break free from the constraints of composure. She nodded, not trusting her own voice yet. They had said everything that could be said during the long nights since the news had come. They had held each other and made promises that felt both eternal and impossibly fragile. They had memorized the sound of each other's breathing, the way their bodies fit together after years of practice, the warmth that passed between them without words. William crossed the room to her, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached her, he didn't immediately pull her into his arms the way he usually would. Instead, he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him that she had never been able to name, but would recognize anywhere. "I keep thinking this is a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That someone will call and say there's been an error, that you don't have to go." Kate reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that had appeared gradually over the years they had been together. Some had come from laughter, carved by countless moments of joy they had shared. Others had been etched by worry, by the constant pressure of living their lives under public scrutiny, by the weight of knowing that their every move affected not just their family, but an entire nation. "We both know that's not going to happen," she said gently. "This is real, William. As real as anything we've ever faced." He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "I don't know how to do this without you." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. In all their years together, through every challenge and triumph, they had faced everything as a team. Even when duty had pulled them in different directions, they had always known they would come back together at the end of the day. This separation felt different, undefined, and open-ended in a way that made planning impossible. Kate thought about the letter she had written the night before, sealed and placed in the drawer of William's bedside table where he would find it after she was gone. In it, she had tried to capture everything she wanted him to remember during the dark moments that would inevitably come. She had written about their first dance at their wedding, about the way he had looked at her when she had emerged from the hospital with each of their newborn children, about quiet Sunday mornings when they had pretended to be just another family reading the papers in bed. But words felt inadequate to contain the fullness of what they had built together. How do you encapsulate 23 years of shared life in a few pages? How do you compress the weight of true partnership into sentences that will have to sustain someone through an indefinite absence? The sound of car doors slamming in the courtyard outside made them both freeze. The moment they had been dreading had arrived with the punctuality of everything in their carefully scheduled lives. Kate felt William's hand tighten over hers, a reflexive attempt to stop time through sheer force of will. "The children," she said, the words coming out rougher than she intended. "They're still sleeping," William replied. I thought it might be easier this way. For them." Kate nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart rebelled against the idea of leaving without seeing their faces one more time. But she had learned that sometimes love meant making the hardest choices, meant protecting others from pain even when it multiplied your own. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment, professional and discreet. They both knew what it meant. The time for goodbye had arrived with all the ceremony, and none of the comfort they might have wished for. William pulled her into his arms then, holding her with the fierce tenderness of someone trying to memorize the exact feel of another person. Kate buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in his scent, and trying to burn the sensation into her memory. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had learned to carry the weight of a nation's expectations but had never prepared for this particular kind of goodbye. When they finally pulled apart, Kate saw that William's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She reached up and smoothed his hair, a gesture so automatic and intimate that it spoke of thousands of similar moments shared in privacy. "This isn't the end," she said firmly, as much for herself as for him. "This is just a pause. A terrible, necessary pause." William nodded, though she could see him struggling with the uncertainty that lay ahead. They had built their life together on the foundation of duty and service, had accepted that their personal desires would often come second to the greater good. But knowing something intellectually and living it with your heart were two entirely different experiences. The knock came again, more insistent this time. William walked to the door and opened it to reveal one of their security detail, his expression professionally neutral despite the gravity of the situation. "Your Royal Highness, it's time," he said quietly. Kate picked up the small bag she had packed the night before, surprised by how light it felt considering it contained everything she would be allowed to take with her. Material possessions had never meant much to her, but the weight of leaving behind photo albums, letters, and all the small objects that held their family's history felt crushing. William took her bag from her, a small act of service that spoke to the gentleman he had been raised to be and the man she had fallen in love with. They walked to the door together, their steps synchronized after years of walking side by side through everything from state occasions to school sports days. At the threshold, Kate paused and looked back at the home that had sheltered their love and witnessed their growth from young newlyweds into parents, partners, and whatever else the future would demand they become. The morning light still streamed through those tall windows, still painted patterns on the floors where her children's feet had left invisible impressions of joy and discovery. "I'll keep everything exactly as you left it," William said, understanding her need to look back without her having to explain it. "That's not what I want," Kate replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I want you to live, William. I want you to live fully and love our children enough for both of us until I can come home." The word home caught in her throat, heavy with all the meaning they had built into this place together. Home wasn't just the palace or even England. Home was wherever they were together, creating the space where their love could exist safely away from the demands of duty and public service. As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Kate felt the first real chill of what lay ahead. The future stretched before them like an unmapped territory, full of dangers they couldn't see and challenges they couldn't prepare for. But it also held the promise of reunion, the hope that love could survive even this ultimate test. The car waited at the bottom of the steps, black and official and utterly final in its presence. Kate had ridden in thousands of such cars, had learned to find comfort in their anonymity and safety. Today, this car represented something else entirely. The vehicle that would carry her away from everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. William helped her into the back seat with the same careful attention he had shown her on their wedding day, his hand steady on her elbow despite the tremor she could feel in his fingers. When she was settled, he leaned down to the open door, bringing his face level with hers one last time. "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of every time he had said them before and every time he would need to remember saying them in the days to come. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that finally began to fall. "Take care of our babies. Tell them every day that Mummy loves them." William nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that had finally overwhelmed his careful composure. He stepped back as the driver prepared to close the door, and Kate saw him standing there in his pajamas and robe, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had seen him in years. As the car began to move, Kate pressed her hand against the window, watching William grow smaller in the distance until he was just a figure in a doorway, then just a memory of warmth against the morning light. She didn't look away until the palace disappeared entirely, taking with it everything she had ever called home. The safe house sat nestled in the Scottish Highlands like a secret whispered into the landscape. Kate had arrived 3 hours ago, but the journey felt like it had taken days, each mile stretching her heart thinner until she wondered if it might simply snap from the strain. The building itself was unremarkable, designed to blend into the rolling hills and ancient stone walls that characterized this remote corner of the world. From the outside, it looked like any other Highland cottage, complete with a slate roof and walls covered in ivy that had clearly been growing for decades. Inside, however, the cottage revealed its true purpose. Every window had been fitted with bulletproof glass, so clear it was almost invisible, and Kate had noticed the subtle bulge of surveillance equipment hidden among the traditional Scottish furnishings. The walls were thicker than they appeared, reinforced with materials that could stop more than just Highland winds. Yet someone had taken care to make the space feel like a home rather than a fortress, with fresh flowers on the kitchen table and a fire already crackling in the stone fireplace when she arrived. Kate stood at the kitchen window now, watching the sun set behind the mountains that rose like ancient guardians around the valley. The view was breathtaking in its wild beauty, so different from the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace that it felt like stepping into another world entirely. She had always loved Scotland, had felt a deep connection to this land that predated her marriage to William and transcended her role as a member of the royal family. Here, surrounded by mountains and mist, she could almost believe she was just another person seeking solitude in the wilderness. Almost, but not quite. The weight of what had brought her here pressed against her consciousness like a physical thing, making her shoulders ache with tension she couldn't release. The secure phone sat on the kitchen counter behind her, silent for now, but representing her only connection to the life she had been forced to leave behind. She had been told she could make one call each evening, under supervision, to maintain contact with her family. The restriction felt both necessary and cruel, a reminder that even her most private moments were no longer truly her own. The sound of footsteps on the flagstone floor made her turn. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison approached with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. Kate had been told that Morrison was one of the finest protection officers in the service, with a reputation for keeping her charges safe while maintaining their dignity and privacy as much as circumstances allowed. "How are you settling in, Your Royal Highness?" Morrison asked, her Scottish accent lending warmth to the formal address. "Please, just Kate," she replied, turning back to the window. "The titles feel strange here, somehow out of place." Morrison nodded, understanding immediately. "This is meant to be your sanctuary, Kate. We'll do everything we can to make it feel like home, even temporarily." Kate appreciated the gesture, but she wondered if anywhere could feel like home without William and the children. Home had become less about place and more about presence over the years, defined not by walls and furniture, but by the sound of her family's laughter, the chaos of breakfast preparations, and the quiet moments when she and William could simply exist together without the weight of their public roles. "Have you heard anything more about how long this might last?" Kate asked, though she knew the answer would be the same as it had been since this nightmare began. "The intelligence services are working around the clock," Morrison replied carefully. "The threat appears to be credible and specific, but these situations can evolve quickly. It could be days, or it could be weeks. We simply don't know yet." Kate nodded, having expected as much. The men in dark suits who had delivered the news had been maddeningly vague about specifics, speaking in the careful language of professionals who revealed only what was absolutely necessary. Someone had made credible threats against her personally, threats serious enough to require immediate action, but not specific enough to allow for a clear timeline of resolution. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent years learning to live with the constant awareness of security threats, had accepted long ago that being a member of the royal family meant accepting certain risks as part of the job. But this felt different, more personal somehow. The threats weren't just against her as a symbol or institution, but against her as a woman, a mother, a person with her own thoughts and feelings and fears. "Would you like me to prepare anything for dinner?" Morrison asked, clearly trying to establish some sense of normalcy in an utterly abnormal situation. "I'm not very hungry," Kate admitted, then caught herself. She had learned over the years to take care of herself not just for her own sake, but for the sake of everyone who depended on her. "But I suppose I should eat something." Morrison smiled with the understanding of someone who had seen this kind of displaced shock before. "Why don't I make us both some soup? There's a wonderful recipe my grandmother used that seems to help when the world feels a bit too much to bear." As Morrison moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, Kate found herself drawn to the family photographs that had been placed strategically around the main living areas. Someone had clearly gone to great lengths to make this place feel personal, and she recognized several pictures from her own collection at Kensington Palace. There was her wedding photo, of course, but also more intimate moments. William holding newborn George with an expression of wonder and terror, Charlotte's first day of school, her little hand tucked securely in Kate's, Louis taking his first steps in the palace gardens while his siblings cheered from the sidelines. Looking at these captured moments, Kate felt the full weight of what this separation meant. It wasn't just about her safety or even her comfort. It was about the disruption of the daily rhythms that held their family together, the thousand small interactions that built love and trust and security in a child's world. George, at 10, was old enough to understand that something serious had happened, but too young to process the full implications. Charlotte, 8, would feel the absence acutely but might not know how to express her confusion and fear. And Louis, still just 5, would simply know that Mummy was gone without understanding why. The thought of her youngest child looking for her in the morning, perhaps standing in their bedroom doorway with his favorite stuffed elephant tucked under his arm, waiting for the cuddle that always started his day, made her chest tighten with a pain so acute it was almost physical. She had never spent more than a day or two away from her children, and even those absences had been carefully planned, with detailed preparations and constant communication. "The photos help," Morrison said gently, having noticed Kate's focus on the images. "It's important to keep the connection strong, especially for the children." "William will have told them by now," Kate said, more to herself than to Morrison. They had discussed how to handle the conversation, had agreed that honesty tempered with age-appropriate explanation would be the best approach. But knowing that it needed to be done and imagining her children's faces as they processed the news were two very different things. Morrison ladled soup into 2 bowls, the rich aroma of vegetables and herbs filling the kitchen with a warmth that felt almost like an embrace. Would you like to call them after dinner? The communications equipment is fully secure, and there's no time limit for family calls in the evening. Kate felt a surge of gratitude toward this woman who seemed to understand the delicate balance between security and humanity. Yes, thank you. I think I need to hear their voices. They ate their soup in comfortable silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of Highland birds settling in for the night. Kate found herself thinking about other meals she had shared in similarly simple circumstances, particularly during their early years at Anglesey when William had been training with the RAF. Those had been some of their happiest times, when they could pretend to be just another young couple finding their way in the world. The cottage reminded her of the farmhouse they had rented then, with its thick walls and simple furnishings and views that stretched to the horizon. She remembered cooking dinner for William after his training flights, how they would sit at their small kitchen table and talk about everything and nothing, building the foundation of intimacy that would carry them through all the challenges that lay ahead. Tell me about your family, Kate said suddenly, surprising herself with the question. She had always been curious about the people who dedicated their lives to protecting others. What drove them to choose such demanding and often thankless work? Morrison smiled, clearly pleased by the personal question. I have 2 daughters, both grown now. Emily is a teacher in Edinburgh, and Rebecca is finishing her medical training in London. My husband passed away 5 years ago, but we had 30 good years together. I'm sorry for your loss, Kate said, meaning it. She had learned over the years that grief was a universal language, one that transcended differences of class or circumstance. Thank you. He was proud of the work I do, understood why it mattered. That made all the difference. Morrison paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. I've been protecting people for almost 20 years now, and I've learned that the hardest part isn't the physical danger. It's the separation, the way these situations pull families apart even when everyone is trying to do the right thing. Kate nodded, grateful for the honesty. How do you bear it? Watching people you're protecting struggle with circumstances they never chose. I remind myself that what we do matters, Morrison replied simply. That keeping people safe, keeping families intact, even when they have to be apart temporarily, is worth the difficulty. And I've seen how strong people can be when they have to be, how love finds a way to bridge even the most impossible distances. After dinner, Kate made her way to the small office where the secure communication equipment had been set up. The room felt like a mission control center, with multiple screens and devices that connected her to a world she could no longer physically access. Morrison showed her how to operate the encrypted video calling system, then discreetly withdrew to give her privacy for her conversation with her family. When William's face appeared on the screen, Kate felt her breath catch. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night and a difficult day. But his smile when he saw her was radiant, full of relief and love and the kind of joy that comes from seeing someone you thought you might not see again soon. Kate, he said, her name carrying all the weight of the hours they had been apart. How are you? Are you safe? Is the place suitable? I'm fine, she assured him, though she could hear the slight tremor in her own voice. It's actually quite beautiful here. Very peaceful. How are the children? How did they take the news? William's expression grew more serious. Better than I expected, honestly. George asked a lot of questions, very practical ones about security and why you specifically needed to be protected. Charlotte cried a bit, but then asked if she could write you letters. And Louis? He paused, smiling despite the circumstances. Louis asked if you were going to see the Loch Ness Monster. Kate laughed, the sound surprising her with its normalcy. That's perfect. Tell him I'll keep an eye out. They want to say hello, William said. Are you ready for that? Kate nodded, steeling herself for what she knew would be both wonderful and heartbreaking. William adjusted the camera, and suddenly, her children's faces filled the screen, crowding around their father with the chaotic energy that had always defined their family gatherings. Mummy, Charlotte's voice came through the speaker bright and clear. Daddy says you're in Scotland. Are there sheep where you are? Lots of sheep, Kate confirmed, drinking in the sight of her daughter's face. And mountains, and probably some Highland cows too. George, ever the serious oldest child, leaned closer to the camera. Mummy, are you really safe there? Papa says the people protecting you are the best in the world. I am very safe, Kate assured him. And I'm being looked after by some truly wonderful people. But I miss you all terribly. We miss you too, Louis chimed in, his 5-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of everything. When are you coming home? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel and too important to ignore. Kate looked at William over their children's heads, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "I don't know exactly when," she said honestly, "but I promise you that I will come home as soon as it's safe to do so. And until then, we'll talk every day, and I'll still be your mummy even when I'm not there to tuck you in at night." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, filled with the kind of mundane details that make up family life. Lewis had lost another tooth. Charlotte had scored her first goal in football practice. George was worried about a mathematics test he had the following week. Kate listened to every word with an intensity that surprised her, storing up these glimpses of their continuing lives like treasures to sustain her through the long hours ahead. When it came time to say goodbye, Kate felt the same tearing sensation she had experienced that morning, the sense that part of herself was being left behind with each person she loved. But there was comfort too in knowing that this wasn't really goodbye, just goodnight across a distance that technology could bridge, if not eliminate. After the call ended, Kate sat alone in the communication room for a long time, staring at the blank screen and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, her biggest worry had been coordinating schedules for the children's summer activities. Now she was in hiding, separated from her family by threats she couldn't control or fully understand. But as she sat in the silence of the Highland cottage, surrounded by mountains that had watched over this land for millennia, Kate felt something unexpected beginning to grow alongside her grief and worry. It was a kind of strength, born not of confidence, but of necessity, the recognition that she would endure this trial because she had no choice but to endure it, and because the love that had brought her to this point would also carry her through it. Outside, the Highland wind picked up, rustling through the heather and carrying with it the scent of wild roses and ancient stone. Kate closed her eyes and let herself imagine that the wind was carrying messages from her family, invisible tokens of love that could traverse any distance and overcome any obstacle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments of longing and uncertainty. But tonight, she was safe, and her family was safe, and that would have to be enough for now. 3 weeks into her stay at the Highland cottage, Kate had developed a routine that helped anchor her days in something resembling normalcy. She woke each morning at 7, drawn from sleep by the sound of sheep bleating in the nearby pastures rather than the gentle chaos of her children preparing for school. The absence of those familiar voices, the missing soundtrack of family life, created a silence that felt both peaceful and profoundly wrong. Her mornings began with tea taken at the kitchen window, watching the mist roll down from the mountains like slow-moving ghosts. The Scottish weather had been unusually cooperative, offering more sunshine than rain, and Kate had begun to understand why people fell in love with this landscape despite its reputation for harsh conditions. There was something healing about the vastness of it, the way the mountains and skies seemed to dwarf human concerns and offer perspective on problems that felt insurmountable in smaller spaces. Morrison had proven to be more than just a protection officer. She had become something approaching a friend, their relationship developing the easy rhythm of people thrown together by circumstances beyond their control who discover they genuinely enjoy each other's company. Each morning, they would walk the perimeter of the safe area together, a security patrol disguised as a peaceful stroll through some of the most beautiful countryside in Britain. During these walks, Kate learned about Morrison's daughters and late husband, about her early days in police work when women were still fighting to be taken seriously in law enforcement, about the cases that had shaped her understanding of human nature and resilience. In return, Kate found herself talking about aspects of her life she rarely discussed with anyone, the challenges of raising children in the public eye, the way duty and love sometimes pulled in opposite directions, the moments of doubt that plagued even someone whose life looked perfect from the outside. "You know," Morrison said one morning as they paused to admire a family of Highland cattle grazing in a distant field, "I've protected a lot of people over the years, and I've learned that the ones who survive situations like this best are those who find ways to grow during the isolation rather than just enduring it." Kate considered this observation as they continued their walk. She had been thinking lately about the person she had been before marriage and motherhood, the interests and dreams that had been set aside not through any conscious choice, but simply because there weren't enough hours in the day to pursue everything she might have wanted. The young woman who had studied art history with genuine passion, who had dreamed of working in museums or galleries, who had believed she might change the world through beauty rather than duty. The cottage had a small library, clearly stocked by someone with excellent taste and an understanding of what kinds of books might comfort a person in exile. Kate had rediscovered her love of reading, something that had been reduced to bedtime stories with the children and briefing materials for official engagements. She worked her way through novels she had always meant to read, biographies of artists and writers, books about Scottish history that helped her understand the land where she had found temporary refuge. But it was the art supplies that Morrison had quietly provided that proved most transformative. They appeared on the kitchen table one morning without comment or fanfare, a simple collection of watercolors, brushes, and paper that seemed to glow with possibility. Kate hadn't painted seriously since university, hadn't allowed herself the luxury of creating something purely for the joy of creation in years. "I thought you might enjoy these," Morrison said when Kate discovered them. "The light here is extraordinary this time of year, and art can be a form of meditation." Kate picked up one of the brushes, feeling its weight and texture with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. "I used to paint," she said quietly, "before everything else took over." "Art doesn't forget you," Morrison replied. "It waits." That afternoon, Kate set up an easel in the cottage's small conservatory, angling it to catch the afternoon light that poured down the valley like liquid gold. She started with simple studies, trying to capture the way shadows moved across the hills, the impossible green of highland grass, the subtle variations in gray that made up the stone walls that crisscrossed the landscape. At first, her hands felt clumsy, uncertain. Years of official handshakes and careful gestures had made her forget the particular intimacy of holding a brush, the way it became an extension of your thoughts and feelings when you surrendered to the process. But gradually, muscle memory returned, along with something deeper and more fundamental, the pure pleasure of watching color flow across paper and slowly resolve into something recognizable yet uniquely hers. She painted the view from her bedroom window at sunrise, when the mountains looked like sleeping giants wrapped in purple mist. She painted the cottage garden, where someone had planted roses that bloomed with defiant beauty despite the highland climate. She painted her hands, studying the familiar lines and calluses that told the story of her life, the wedding ring that caught light like a small sun, the scar on her thumb from helping George build a treehouse 3 summers ago. But it was the portrait of William that surprised her with its power and precision. She painted him from memory, capturing not his official face, the composed expression he wore for cameras and ceremonies, but the private William she knew best. The man who made terrible jokes at breakfast, who read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, who could still make her laugh until she cried on their rare evenings alone together. In the painting, his eyes held all the warmth and intelligence that had first attracted her, but also the weight of responsibility that had accumulated over their years together. She painted the lines around his eyes, earned through years of genuine smiles and worried sleepless nights in equal measure. She painted his hands, strong and gentle, capable of signing state documents and braiding Charlotte's hair with equal skill. When she stepped back from the finished portrait, Kate felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. The painting wasn't technically perfect, her skills remained rusty after years of neglect, but it captured something essential about the man she loved, something that no official photograph could ever convey. Morrison found her there as the sun was setting, standing before the easel with tears on her cheeks that she hadn't noticed falling. "It's beautiful," Morrison said simply. "You've captured something true about him." "I miss him so much it feels like a physical thing sometimes," Kate admitted. "Like part of my body has been removed, and I keep forgetting it's not there anymore." Morrison nodded with the understanding of someone who had experienced profound loss. Grief and longing can be teachers if we let them. They show us what matters most, strip away everything that's just noise. That evening's call with her family revealed changes that Kate both celebrated and mourned. George had thrown himself into his studies with an intensity that worried his tutors, as if academic achievement could somehow bring his mother home faster. Charlotte had become more protective of Louis, taking on a maternal role that spoke to her natural empathy, but also revealed how deeply the family disruption had affected her understanding of security and safety. Louis, with the resilience of childhood, seemed to be adapting best to their new reality. He had decided that his mother was on an adventure, like the heroes in his favorite books, and had begun drawing pictures of Scottish castles and monsters for her to discover during her stay in the Highlands. His innocent acceptance of the situation both comforted and devastated Kate, highlighting how much trust children place in the adults responsible for their safety. William looked better than he had in previous calls, though Kate could see the effort it cost him to maintain composure for the children's sake. They had developed a system of communication that went beyond words, small gestures, and expressions that conveyed information the children didn't need to hear. A slight nod meant the security situation remained unchanged. A particular smile meant he was coping better than expected. A way of touching his wedding ring meant he loved her and was counting the hours until they could be together again. After the children had said goodnight and William had carried Louis off to bed, Kate and her husband shared a few minutes of private conversation that felt more intimate than any physical embrace could have been. They talked about small things, the kind of mundane details that make up the fabric of marriage. William told her about a conversation he'd had with his father about modernizing certain palace protocols. Kate described the Highland cattle she had discovered during her morning walk, their comical appearance, and surprisingly gentle demeanor. But underneath these surface conversations ran deeper currents of longing and concern. Kate could see the strain in William's face, the way he was trying to be both father and mother to their children while managing his own grief and worry. She knew he was probably staying up too late, working himself harder than usual as a way of avoiding the empty spaces in their home where her presence should have been. "I've started painting again," she told him, the admission feeling both significant and slightly embarrassing. William's face lit up with genuine delight. "Kate, that's wonderful. You were so talented. I always thought it was a shame you didn't have more time for it." "Maybe that's what this time is for," she said, surprising herself with the thought. "Maybe I'm meant to rediscover parts of myself I've forgotten in the rush of everything else." They talked for a few more minutes before the call ended, but Kate found herself thinking about her words long after the screen went dark. Was it possible to find purpose in this exile, to transform what felt like punishment into something approaching opportunity? The idea felt almost treacherous, like betraying the gravity of their situation, but it also offered a way forward that didn't involve simply counting days until her return. Over the following days, Kate threw herself into painting with an intensity that surprised Morrison and herself. She painted the cottage garden at different times of day, fascinated by how light could transform the same scene into something entirely different. She painted Morrison reading by the fireplace, capturing the concentration and wisdom in her protector's face. She painted the Highland landscape in different weather, learning how rain and sunshine and mist each revealed different aspects of the same dramatic terrain. But it was the series of paintings she began of her children's bedrooms at Kensington Palace that proved most emotionally complex. Working entirely from memory, she painted George's room with its carefully organized books and model airplanes, trying to capture the personality of a boy balanced between childhood and the growing awareness of his future responsibilities. She painted Charlotte's room with its mix of princess dresses and football boots, the perfect expression of a girl who refused to be limited by anyone else's expectations. Louis's room proved the most challenging and cathartic to paint. His space was still purely that of a little boy, filled with stuffed animals and picture books and the chaos that comes from someone who lives entirely in the present moment. As she painted his favorite elephant, worn soft from years of bedtime snuggles, Kate found herself crying for the first time since arriving at the cottage, not from despair, but from the overwhelming power of love that distance couldn't diminish. The paintings became a form of communication with herself, a way of processing emotions too complex for words. Through them, she explored not just her longing for her family, but also her relationship with duty, beauty, isolation, and identity. She painted self-portraits that revealed aspects of herself she had never examined, studies of her own hands that became meditations on the things she had built and held and lost and found again. Morrison watched this artistic renaissance with the satisfaction of someone who had prescribed exactly the right medicine. She never commented directly on the paintings, but Kate would sometimes catch her studying them with the appreciation of someone who understood that art could be both escape and engagement, both retreat from the world and deeper penetration into its essential truths. "You're becoming yourself again," Morrison said one evening as they prepared dinner together, a routine that had evolved into something approaching domestic harmony. "I'm not sure I knew I had lost myself," Kate replied, considering the observation seriously. "It happens gradually, especially to people who give so much of themselves to others. The self gets layered over with roles and responsibilities until you forget there was an original person underneath it all. Kate thought about this as she chopped vegetables for their soup, another skill she had rediscovered during her exile. Cooking for just two people felt both liberating and strange after years of managing family meals that had to account for three children's different preferences, William's schedule, and the constant presence of staff and security. "What happens when I go back?" she asked. "How do I keep this version of myself alive in the world that's waiting for me?" Morrison smiled, understanding immediately what Kate was really asking. "You don't try to keep everything the same. You take what matters most and find ways to weave it into your real life. You remember that being a mother and wife doesn't mean erasing the individual woman who existed before those roles and will continue to exist within them." That night, Kate started a new painting, perhaps the most ambitious she had attempted since beginning this unexpected artistic retreat. She painted her family not as they appeared in official photographs, but as she saw them in her heart. William reading to their children in the big chair in their private sitting room, all four of them tangled together in the intimate chaos of family life. The painting captured something official photography never could, the particular quality of light that exists only in spaces where people love each other without performance or pretense. As she worked on the painting over several days, adding layers of detail and meaning, Kate began to understand that this enforced separation had given her something precious along with everything it had taken away. It had given her perspective on the life she had built, appreciation for blessings she had begun to take for granted, and reconnection with parts of herself that she had thought were permanently lost to the demands of duty and motherhood. The painting of her family became not just a way of missing them, but a celebration of what they meant to her and what she brought to their shared life. In capturing their love on canvas, she was also documenting her own capacity for devotion, her role as the person who saw them most clearly and loved them most completely. Outside the cottage windows, the Highland landscape continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama but somehow comforting in its permanence. Kate had learned to read the moods of these mountains, to find peace in their endurance and strength in their ability to weather any storm. She was painting not just with pigment and water now, but with time itself, creating something that would outlast this temporary exile and serve as a reminder of everything she had learned about love, loss, resilience, and the unexpected ways that isolation could lead to the deepest forms of connection with the people and places that truly mattered. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early October, 6 weeks after Kate had arrived at the Highland cottage. She was in the middle of painting the sunrise over the valley, trying to capture the particular quality of autumn light that seemed to set the entire landscape ablaze with gold and amber, when Morrison appeared in the conservatory doorway with an expression Kate had never seen before. "We need to talk," Morrison said quietly, and something in her tone made Kate set down her brush immediately, her heart beginning to race with the kind of adrenaline that had become familiar over the weeks of uncertainty. They sat in the kitchen, morning tea growing cold between them as Morrison explained the developments that would change everything once again. The security services had made significant progress in their investigation, tracking down several members of the network that had prompted Kate's protective custody. But with progress came complications, new intelligence that suggested the threat was both broader and more immediate than originally believed. "They want to move you," Morrison said, her professional demeanor softening with what looked like genuine regret. "Somewhere more secure, more isolated. The cottage here was always meant to be temporary, but this accelerates everything." Kate felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the way it had when this whole nightmare began. Just as she had started to find rhythm and purpose in her Highland exile, just as she had begun to think of the cottage as a kind of home, she was being asked to leave it all behind for another unknown destination. "Where?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The Outer Hebrides. There's a facility on one of the smaller islands, completely isolated but equipped with everything you'll need. It's going to be more restrictive than here." Kate nodded, understanding the implications without needing them spelled out. The island would mean no walks beyond a limited perimeter, no contact with the outside world beyond her daily calls to family, no Morrison to provide companionship and conversation. It would mean true isolation in a way that the cottage, for all its remoteness, had never been. "How long?" she asked. Morrison's hesitation told Kate everything she needed to know. "They're not sure. The investigation has become more complex. It could be weeks or months," Kate finished, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. They spent the rest of the morning packing Kate's belongings, including the art supplies that had become so important to her daily life, and the paintings that represented her emotional journey through the first stage of this ordeal. Morrison helped her wrap the canvases carefully, understanding without being told that these were more than just artwork. They were documentation of survival and growth under impossible circumstances. The painting of William went into a protective tube, along with the family portrait and several Highland landscapes that Kate hoped might help the sterile island facility feel more like a place where a human being could live rather than simply exist. The self-portraits and studies of her hands would stay with her too, reminders of who she was beneath all the roles and titles and security concerns. As they prepared for departure, Kate found herself thinking about the cycles of loss and adaptation that had shaped these weeks. She had grieved leaving Kensington Palace and her family, then slowly learned to find purpose and even happiness in the Highland cottage. Now she was facing another separation, another beginning, another test of her ability to maintain her sense of self in the face of circumstances beyond her control. The helicopter that came to collect her was different from the cars and official vehicles she was accustomed to, military in its efficiency and impersonal in its design. As they lifted off from the Highland Valley, Kate watched the cottage grow smaller below them. The place that had sheltered her artistic renaissance and emotional healing reduced to a dot on the landscape before disappearing entirely into the vast Scottish countryside. Morrison accompanied her on the journey, another kindness that Kate would treasure in the more difficult days to come. They flew northwest over increasingly wild and remote territory, the landscape below changing from highland hills to coastal cliffs, and, finally, to the scattered islands of the Outer Hebrides, each one looking more isolated and forbidding than the last. The island where they landed barely deserved the name, more a large rock thrust up from the Atlantic with enough grass and heather to support a few sheep and the handful of buildings that comprised the secure facility. Kate could see the entire perimeter from the helicopter, a space perhaps half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, surrounded on all sides by gray ocean that stretched to the horizon without interruption. The buildings were modern and well-designed, clearly constructed with both security and long-term habitability in mind. But there was no disguising the essential nature of the place. This was a prison designed for someone whose only crime was existing in a world where other people's hatred made normal life impossible. Agent David MacLeod met them at the landing pad, a tall man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who had spent years in challenging environments. His handshake was firm and his manner professional, but not unkind, and Kate found herself grateful for small mercies as he led them toward the main building. "Your Royal Highness," he said as they walked, "I know this is a difficult transition. We've tried to make the facility as comfortable as possible while maintaining the security standards required." The main building was larger than it had appeared from the air, with several connected sections that housed living quarters, communications equipment, recreational facilities, and the staff areas needed to support a long-term protection operation. Kate's quarters occupied one entire wing, with a bedroom, sitting room, small kitchen, and what MacLeod described as a studio space where she could continue her artistic work. "Morrison told us about your painting," he explained as he showed her the studio, a bright room with large windows facing south to catch the best available light. "We've arranged for supplies to be delivered regularly, and there's a video link to art instructors in London if you'd like formal lessons." Kate nodded her appreciation, touched that people she had never met were thinking about her psychological well-being as well as her physical safety. The room felt sterile compared to the cottage conservatory where she had rediscovered her love of painting, but it had potential, space she could transform into something approaching sanctuary if she could find the strength to begin again. Morrison stayed for 3 hours, long enough to help Kate settle in and understand the routines that would structure her days on the island. There would be scheduled exercise periods in a small gymnasium, access to a library that had been stocked with carefully chosen books, and video call capabilities that would allow her to maintain contact with family and a limited circle of friends and staff members. But when the time came for Morrison to leave, Kate felt the familiar tearing sensation that had marked every separation of the past 6 weeks. Morrison had become more than just a protector. She had been a companion, confidant, and gentle guide through the most challenging period of Kate's adult life. "You're going to be all right," Morrison said as they stood at the landing pad, the helicopter engines warming up behind them. "You're stronger than you know, and You've learned how to find purpose even in the most difficult circumstances. Kate hugged her, breaking protocol without caring about the watching eyes of the security team. Thank you, she said, for everything, for helping me remember who I am. Morrison stepped back, her own eyes bright with emotion. Don't forget to keep painting. Don't forget that beauty can exist anywhere, even here. As the helicopter lifted off, taking Morrison back toward the mainland and the normal world Kate couldn't access, Kate stood alone on the island that would be her home for an unknowable period of time. The wind coming off the Atlantic was constant and cold, carrying the salt smell of deep ocean and the cries of seabirds that seemed to mock human concerns with their wild freedom. That evening, Kate spoke with her family for the first time from her new location. The children's faces on the video screen seemed smaller somehow, more distant, as if the additional miles of separation had weakened the technological connection that was their only link. William tried to maintain his usual composed demeanor, but Kate could see the strain in his eyes, the way this news of her second relocation had affected him. It's temporary, she assured him, though neither of them knew if that was true. And the place is actually quite well appointed. I have a proper studio for painting, and the views are extraordinary. She described the facility in positive terms, emphasizing the professional competence of the staff and the thoughtful amenities that had been provided. But she could see that William understood what she wasn't saying, that this move represented an escalation rather than progress toward resolution, a deepening of their separation rather than movement toward reunion. The children adapted to the news with the resilience that had sustained them through 6 weeks of their mother's absence. George asked technical questions about the island's location and the security measures in place, his analytical mind trying to find patterns and logic in a situation that had little of either. Charlotte wanted to know if there were ponies on the island, and seemed disappointed to learn that the only animals were sheep and seabirds. Louis, as always, cut straight to the heart of everything. Are you lonely, Mummy? He asked, his 5-year-old directness piercing through all the careful explanations and diplomatic language. Kate considered the question seriously, looking around the sterile but comfortable room where she sat surrounded by technology that connected her to family she couldn't touch. Sometimes I am lonely, she admitted. But I think about all of you every day, and that helps. And I have my painting to keep me company. After the call ended, Kate sat in the silence of her island prison and tried to inventory what she had gained and lost in this latest transition. She had lost Morrison's companionship, the relative freedom of the Highland cottage, the sense that her exile might be temporary and manageable. But she had kept her painting supplies, her growing understanding of her own resilience, and the knowledge that love could survive even the most impossible separations. The studio called to her, its empty easel waiting like a challenge. Kate set up her supplies methodically, arranging colors and brushes with the precision of someone preparing for battle. She had learned that painting could be both escape and engagement, both retreat from difficult circumstances and deeper exploration of them. She began with the view from her window, the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean that would be her horizon for the foreseeable future. But, as she worked, the seascape began to change under her brush, becoming less about the physical reality of her isolation and more about the emotional landscape of separation and endurance. The waves became thoughts of her children, constant and rhythmic and ever-changing. The horizon became the future, undefined but somehow hopeful despite its uncertainty. The sky became memory, vast enough to hold every moment of happiness she had experienced, and strong enough to carry her through whatever lay ahead. As she painted through her first night on the island, Kate began to understand that this new exile would require different strengths than the Highland cottage had demanded. There, she had rediscovered her individual identity within the context of temporary separation. Here, she would need to find ways to maintain her humanity in the face of profound isolation, to nurture hope when the future had become completely unknowable. But she had her art, and she had love that needed no physical presence to remain real and sustaining. She had learned that exile could be a teacher as well as a punishment, that enforced solitude could reveal strengths and capacities that normal life never demanded. Outside her window, the Atlantic Ocean continued its ancient conversation with the rocky shore, indifferent to human drama but somehow comforting in its permanence. Kate painted until dawn, creating something that was both a record of her new reality and a declaration that beauty and meaning could exist anywhere, even on a windswept island where the only companions were memory, hope, and the endless creative possibility of transforming suffering into art. The sun rose over the ocean like a promise, painting the gray waves with gold and reminding Kate that even in the most isolated places, light found ways to break through and transform everything it touched. The news came on a morning in late November when the island was wrapped in a mist so thick that Kate couldn't see the ocean from her window, only gray upon gray until the world seemed to have dissolved into nothingness. She had been on the island for 7 weeks, had painted 17 seascapes and 3 self-portraits, had read 12 books, and had 249 conversations with her family through the video link that was her only connection to the world beyond this windswept rock. Agent McLeod found her in the studio, where she was working on what had become her most ambitious project yet, a large canvas that attempted to capture not just the physical reality of the island, but the emotional experience of isolation transformed into solitude, loneliness alchemized into self-discovery. The painting was layered with weeks of work, colors built up and scraped away, and built up again as Kate explored the complex feelings that her exile had revealed. "Your Royal Highness," McLeod said, his voice carrying something she hadn't heard before, something that made her set down her brush with hands that had begun to tremble before her mind had fully processed what his tone might mean. "Please," she said, turning to face him fully. "Just tell me directly." McLeod smiled, and Kate realized she had never seen him smile before, not in 7 weeks of professional courtesy and careful management of her impossible situation. "We're taking you home," he said. "The operation is complete. The threats have been neutralized. You're going home today." The words seemed to hang in the misty air of the studio, too important and too wonderful to be immediately real. Kate had imagined this moment countless times during her weeks of exile, had rehearsed her reaction and prepared herself for the overwhelming relief and joy she expected to feel. But now that it was actually happening, she found herself strangely calm, as if some part of her had always known that this day would come and had been quietly preparing for it. "Today?" she repeated, needing to hear the words again to make them real. "The helicopter will be here in 3 hours," McLeod confirmed. "We'll have you back in London by evening." Kate looked around the studio that had become so familiar, at the canvases that documented her journey through isolation and back toward the world. The painting she had been working on was unfinished, would always be unfinished now, but she found herself strangely at peace with that incompleteness. Some experiences couldn't be fully captured or concluded. They could only be lived through and transformed into whatever wisdom they might contain. "I need to call my family," she said, the practical reality of homecoming beginning to penetrate the dreamlike quality of the moment. "Of course," McLeod agreed. "But perhaps we should pack your belongings first? The weather window for departure is limited." Kate nodded, understanding the urgency, even as part of her wanted to slow down this transition, to process what it meant to leave behind the island that had been both prison and sanctuary. She had complained about her exile, had grieved the separation from her family, but she had also found something here that she wasn't sure she wanted to lose. They packed her paintings first, wrapping each canvas carefully in protective materials that would shield them during transport. McLeod helped without comment or question, understanding somehow that these weren't just souvenirs, but essential documents of survival and growth. The self-portraits went into a special case, along with the studies of her hands that had become meditations on identity and purpose. As they worked, Kate found herself thinking about the woman who had arrived on this island 7 weeks ago, how different she felt from that person who had been consumed with grief and uncertainty. The separation from her family had been agonizing, but it had also given her something unexpected, a clarity about what mattered most, and a confidence in her own ability to endure whatever challenges life might present. "You know," McLeod said as they sealed the final box of art supplies, "I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone adapt to isolation the way you have. Most people just count days and try to survive until they can return to their normal lives. But you use the time differently." Kate paused in her packing to consider his observation. "I had to find a way to make it mean something," she said finally. "Otherwise, it would have destroyed me." The call to her family was everything she had imagined, and more. William's face when she told him the news was worth every day of separation, every moment of longing and uncertainty. The children's excitement was infectious, Louis jumping up and down so enthusiastically that he nearly knocked over the camera, Charlotte asking a dozen questions about when exactly she would arrive and what she wanted for dinner. George trying to maintain his older brother composure while his eyes shone with relief and joy. "I love you," William said when the children had finally been persuaded to go get ready for school, understanding that Mummy would be home when they returned. "I love you, and I've missed you, and I can't wait to hold you again." "I love you too," Kate replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And William? I think I'm coming home as a slightly different person than the one who left. I hope that's all right." "Any version of you is more than all right," he assured her. "It's perfect." The helicopter ride back to the mainland passed in a blur of gray ocean and scattered islands, each mile bringing her closer to a life that felt both completely familiar and slightly foreign after weeks of isolation. Kate found herself thinking about the paintings she was bringing home, wondering how they would look hanging in the bright, busy rooms of Kensington Palace, whether the profound silence they had been created in could survive the chaos and noise of normal family life. From the mainland, a car took her south through Scotland and into England, landscape rolling past the windows that grew increasingly familiar as they approached London. Kate dozed fitfully during the journey, her body finally allowing exhaustion to claim her now that the hyper-vigilance of protective custody was no longer necessary. She woke as they entered London, the familiar density of traffic and pedestrians and general human activity feeling almost overwhelming after weeks of seeing only MacLeod and his small team. The city seemed impossibly busy, impossibly complicated, full of people pursuing their own urgent concerns without any awareness that someone who had been forgotten by the world was returning to reclaim her place in it. Kensington Palace appeared around a corner like a vision from a half-remembered dream. Kate had driven through these gates thousands of times, but today the approach felt ceremonial, weighted with significance that had nothing to do with protocol or duty and everything to do with the simple miracle of homecoming. William was waiting in the courtyard, having clearly abandoned whatever official obligations might have demanded his attention in favor of being present for her return. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of weeks of worry and single parenthood, and the particular strain of maintaining public composure while your private world has been turned upside down. But his smile when he saw her was radiant, transforming his face back into the young man she had fallen in love with at university, before duty and responsibility had claimed so much of their spontaneous joy. He waited until the car stopped completely before approaching, protocol ingrained too deeply to be abandoned even in moments of profound personal relief. When Kate stepped out of the car and into his arms, she felt something fundamental click back into place, a sense of completeness that she had carried the ache of without fully understanding how profound the absence had been. William held her with the careful intensity of someone handling something precious and fragile, as if she might disappear again if he loosened his grip even slightly. "You're really here," he murmured against her hair. "You're really home." "I'm really home," she confirmed, allowing herself to sink into the warmth and safety of his embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, two people finding their way back to each other after a separation that had tested every assumption they had made about the permanence of their life together. When they finally pulled apart, William studied her face with the attention of someone looking for changes, signs of how the experience had marked her. "You look different," he said, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "Older somehow, but also more yourself, if that makes sense." Kate smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "I had a lot of time to think, to remember who I was before I became who I needed to be. I found some things I thought I had lost forever." The sound of running feet on gravel announced the arrival of their children, who burst from the palace doors with the unrestrained enthusiasm that Kate had been missing like a physical ache. George reached her first, still young enough to forget dignity in the face of his mother's return, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face against her shoulder. Charlotte arrived seconds later, followed by Louis, who launched himself at Kate's legs with the complete confidence of a child who had never doubted that his mother would come back to him. Kate sank down to their level, gathering all three children into an embrace that felt like the resolution of every prayer she had offered during her weeks of exile. "Mummy," Louis said, his face serious despite his obvious joy, "did you really see the Loch Ness Monster?" Kate laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease and naturalness. "I saw lots of amazing things," she said, "and I painted pictures of all of them to show you." The evening that followed was ordinary in all the best ways. Bath time with arguments about hair washing, bedtime stories that ran longer than they should have, and the particular chaos of three children all trying to tell their mother everything that had happened during her absence at the same time. Kate absorbed every moment with the heightened appreciation of someone who had learned not to take such domestic miracles for granted. Later, after the children were asleep and she and William had shared a quiet dinner of takeaway Chinese food eaten off their good china in a combination of celebration and exhaustion, Kate showed him the paintings she had brought home from her exile. William studied each canvas with the attention of someone looking at historical documents rather than art, understanding that these painted surfaces contained the emotional record of their separation and her survival. When he reached the portrait of himself that she had painted in the Highland cottage, he was quiet for a long time. "Is this how you see me?" he asked finally. "It's how I love you," Kate replied. "Not the public version or the dutiful version, but the real you that exists in our private moments." William looked at the painting again, then at her. "I want to understand what this time was like for you," he said. "All of it, not just the missing us part, but whatever else you discovered." So Kate told him about the Highland cottage and Morrison's wisdom, about rediscovering painting and the way art had become a form of prayer and meditation. She told him about the island and the profound isolation that had forced her to confront questions about identity and purpose that she had been avoiding for years. She told him about the strength she had found in solitude and the clarity that had emerged from being stripped down to her essential self. "I don't want to lose what I found there," she admitted as they prepared for bed, moving through familiar nighttime routines that felt both completely natural and slightly miraculous. "I know our life is complicated and demanding, but I want to find ways to keep painting, to keep that connection to the part of myself that exists independent of all our roles and responsibilities." William nodded, understanding immediately. "Then, we'll make sure that happens," he said simply. "We'll find the time and space, whatever it takes." As Kate lay in her own bed for the first time in almost 3 months, listening to William's familiar breathing beside her and the distant sounds of London beyond their windows, she felt something she hadn't expected, not just relief at being home, but gratitude for the journey that had brought her back to this moment with new eyes and a deeper appreciation for everything it meant. The separation had been terrible and necessary and ultimately transformative. She had learned that love could survive any distance, that art could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the self she thought she had lost to marriage and motherhood was still there, waiting to be rediscovered whenever she had the courage to look. Outside, London continued its endless activity, millions of people pursuing their own complicated lives while Kate Middleton, wife and mother and individual woman, closed her eyes and felt truly at home for the first time in months, knowing that she had found her way back not just to her family but to herself.